Nuneaton is among the least known towns in Warwickshire, yet it was here that a 15-year-old schoolgirl was horrendously murdered almost 30 years ago. Her final steps included dropping a letter into a postbox, and due to the severity of her murder just a couple of hours after that, authorities took an unusual step to find the killer. They also used the expertise of Paul Britton, one of the UK's best-known criminal profilers, alongside the assistance of the newly established Forensic Science Service. The question remained though, would all of this effort be enough to capture the killer? Well, let's find out by deep diving into the case. In 1995, the population of Nuneaton, which can be found between Coventry and Birmingham, was estimated at close to 70,000, making it the largest while at the same time the least known town in Warwickshire. One of its famous residents was Mary Ann Evans, known by her pen name George Eliot, who was a novelist, poet, translator, and one of the leading writers of the Victorian era. Her name has been immortalised in Nuneaton, with two statues in her honour, one in the town centre and one at the George Eliot Hospital, which was named after her. Her impact on the literary world is also remembered at a place of education, the George Eliot School, and all of this highlights that this famous woman left her mark on Nuneaton in a very good way. However, due to the nature of our content, we're not talking about someone who did good, but rather it's about an individual who left a very bad mark on the same town when murdering 15-year-old Naomi Smith. Naomi Smith was born on the 4th of March 1980 in Coventry, England, but grew up in Nuneaton, Warwickshire, a region of the West Midlands. She was a red-haired, freckle-faced, beautiful young woman who enjoyed the companionship of many friends. She also loved listening to Take That, Michael Jackson and E17. At school, she was working hard in her studies, being on course to sit 9 GCSEs at Artshill High School, which was only a 10-minute walk from her home. Her career goal seemed to be heading toward either childcare, as she was a people's person, or as a vet, due to her love of animals. When at home, it was normal for youngsters on Bretsall Estate, which was on the outskirts of Nuneaton where Naomi lived, to stay out late, including after dark at times, especially as most of the teenagers were friends of each other. Naomi was the youngest in the family and the only girl amongst 4 siblings. Her brothers were David, Clayton and Andrew. Her parents described her as a shy girl who lacked confidence, and people within the community saw her as a quiet, respectable individual. Brian and Kathy Smith, like the majority of parents, were protective of their children, and this was demonstrated on that fateful Thursday night on the 14th of September 1995. At around 9:30 and 9:45 p.m, young Naomi ran an errand for her mother, who asked her to pop out to the local postbox to post a letter, which was literally 100 yards away from their home. It was located on the main road that ran through Anthony Common, literally a 2 to 3 minute return trip. However, by 10 p.m, Naomi still hadn't returned, and Brian and Kathy, they weren't too concerned at this point. They probably presumed she'd met a friend while out and was chatting on one of the corners. Yet when the clock struck 11, her parents were beginning to feel rather worried, as it was unusual for Naomi to be out at that hour. Brian decided to get in his car and drive around to look for his daughter, but first he made a visit to Naomi's best friend's home to check if she was there. The friend was a young girl named Emma, who spent a lot of time with Naomi. In fact, just a few hours previously, Naomi accompanied Emma to a local marching band rehearsal to provide moral support. That's the kind of girl she was, as Emma played the xylophone there. Now, after the session ended, Naomi was dropped off and was seen entering her home. By the time Brian made contact with Emma, Naomi had been missing for about an hour and a half. Now, Emma became concerned and joined Brian in the search, showing him the places they often hung out, but Naomi couldn't be contacted. Eventually, after this frantic search, Brian drove into the Anthony Common car park belonging to the local recreation ground just before midnight. As he put his headlights on facing the playground, he received the biggest shock of his life, and Emma experienced it with him. Naomi was finally discovered, only hours away from home, slumped on the floor of the playground underneath a slide. Her own father and best friend were the people who found her, and will never forget what they saw that night for as long as they live. See, Naomi's body was covered in blood and it was obvious she was dead. Fortunately, Brian didn't see the full extent of his daughter's injuries, but I can tell you this, young Naomi experienced the kind of brutality that no one deserves. The police were immediately notified, and I can't imagine the agonising pain that her parents plus her brothers David, Clays and Andrew and her best friend Emma were having to deal with. Emma ended up being seen by officers from the Specialist Child Protection Unit, as this was a traumatic event that disturbed her immensely. And Kathy, well, she was able to somehow pick the phone up to ring her 25-year-old son David, who was in Birmingham on that night, and she told him something had happened to Naomi and he needed to come home immediately. Now, David responded by making the 40-minute drive from Birmingham to Nuneaton with his mind consumed with all kinds of possibilities regarding his sister, but death didn't appear to be one of them. Once he arrived at Bretsall Estate, which is normally quiet, this particular night it was buzzing with a wall of flashing lights and a number of police officers. Once he finally realised what had happened, he found his mother in the house and, in his words, she was in absolute tatters, which makes complete sense. A few yards away in the park, Brian was a broken man, sitting on the floor close to where he found his daughter, in a deep state of shock. David explained how he felt after witnessing what he saw. The main feeling that he recalled was that of numbness. It was as if he'd walked into a storyline on the television that wasn't real. But the problem was, it was real. And not only that, it gets worse. A post-mortem examination carried out later revealed that she'd been sexually assaulted by someone. The perpetrator cut her throat with extreme violence and force to the point that the slash almost went from one ear to the other one. And Naomi's body had also been deliberately damaged, particularly below the waist. The wounds were severe, revealing the use of a sharp instrument. The killer inflicted further mistreatment by biting into this young girl's left breast, leaving his bite mark. Detectives investigating the case identified this as, without doubt, a frenzied attack. Whoever was capable of inflicting this kind of brutality onto a 15-year-old was a high-risk offender who needed to be caught urgently. The hunt was on, and the question occupying everybody's mind was who committed this cold-hearted murder. To find out required an extensive investigation, which was headed by Detective Superintendent Tony Bayliss of Warwickshire Police. Now, an incident room was set up and established at the neighbouring Bedworth Police Station just a few miles away. The day after the murder, on Friday the 15th of September, police search teams focused their attention around the recreation ground searching for clues. Initially, bad weather got in the way, but nonetheless they continued their detailed inspection over the following few days. But although the area was saturated by police, unfortunately nothing was recovered pertaining to a weapon that might have been used. Around 50 officers were assigned to go from door to door making inquiries, while simultaneously recalling witness statements. Bayliss, the detective in charge, made several appeals directly to the general public through the media. Now, on Saturday the 16th, police held a press conference to appeal for information. 3 or 4 young people had been spotted in the area between 10 and 11 p.m. on the evening of the murder. Therefore, police appealed for the youths to come forward and offered a reward of £10,000 for any information that might lead to a conviction. Naomi's parents, Brian and Kathy, her brother David, as well as best friend Emma, made personal appeals for information, and this was a crime that needed, of course, to be solved as soon as possible, as it appeared that a disturbed and dangerous man or woman was roaming around the streets of Nuneaton. And this is where that unusual step took place. Naomi's parents gave permission for the police to share details of the injuries their daughter suffered by making them public. The hope behind this objective was simple: to see if someone knew something or had a strong suspicion of who may have committed this crime. So over the next few weeks, several house raids were conducted by the authorities, with a number of people being arrested and then released without charge. However, any evidence acquired was sent off for testing, and a month after Naomi's death, Detective Tony Bayliss announced some very good news, that a DNA profile of the killer had finally been obtained. One of Britain's best-known criminal profilers, forensic psychologist Paul Britton, who's been involved in lots of high-profile cases such as with Fred and Rose West, James Bulger, as well as the Rachel Nicholl investigation, was working with investigators regarding this case and provided a profile of who to look for. According to Britton, they were looking for a male aged between 15 to 28 who would have known the victim, someone with a history of violence, who lived within a half-a-mile radius of the crime scene. As a result of this, an offender profile of 800 local men aged between that age group was then produced for DNA mass screening. This wasn't the first time DNA had been used to solve a murder. A few years prior to this, Colin Pitchfork murdered 2 schoolgirls in Leicestershire, becoming the first to be captured using DNA fingerprinting techniques. You can watch the video I made about that by clicking up here somewhere. However, in the case of Naomi, it was the first time the Forensic Science Service had carried out mass DNA screening. This specific service had only been set up in the April of '95 as the world's first DNA database, and it was used for the very first time in relationship to Naomi's murder just a few miles from Leicestershire, where Colin Pitchfork operated. Once the profile was out, people became rather dubious of each other, as Brett's Hall estate became gripped by fear. However, there was some good news when saliva found on Naomi's body was put under the microscope by scientists, and they discovered a mixed profile. Her body contained DNA belonging to the killer. Those 800 men mentioned earlier, who lived within a half-mile radius from the crime scene, were of deep interest to the police, who believed one of them was the killer. Interestingly, DNA swab samples started to be collected, and within 2 weeks, scientists made another breakthrough. During mid-November '95, 4 additional arrests were made, and one of the men arrested was a 19-year-old named Edwin Hopkins. Earlier, I mentioned that the authorities decided to release the details of the injuries sustained by Naomi, and the idea behind that was to move someone to stop protecting whoever it was that potentially committed this awful crime. And guess who came forward? It was none other than the sister of the arrested 19-year-old. When police conducted door-to-door inquiries taking hundreds of statements, one of these came from Edwin, who claimed he was at his sister's house at the time of the murder. His sister confirmed this statement to the police, providing an alibi for him. Although he was there on the night in question, it soon transpired that around 9:30 p.m. he went to the local off-licence on his push bike to buy beer and crisps, which was in close proximity to the post box Naomi used that night. Now, Hopkins reported that he hadn't seen anyone or anything of a suspicious nature. But his sister became suspicious when she thought things through a little deeper and changed her story. Despite initially confirming Edwin's statement to police and providing him an alibi, she later revealed that Hopkins had taken longer to return from the off-licence than was necessary. And when he did return, it was about 45 minutes later. Plus, he changed into different clothing. His explanation to his sister was that he tried to buy milk and spilt some of it on his clothes, prompting him to change them. He also told another story about being stopped by a man for not having lights on his bike, who told him off for that. All of this clearly didn't sit very well with his sister in the end, as she was now aware of the sadistic injuries that fell upon young Naomi due to what she heard through the media. Alarmingly, she went on to talk about her brother's obsession with knives, including large hunting knives that he collected, and he was in the habit of carrying a knife around with him at all times. By now, things weren't looking too good for Edwin. There's another disturbing element to this. Naomi visited his sister's place about a year before her death with a friend of hers who was babysitting, and on that occasion, Edwin was there, proudly displaying his prized knife collection to Naomi. Chillingly, one of those knives she was looking at could have been the one that ended her life the following year. It also came out that Edwin enjoyed killing and skinning rabbits. However, that didn't seem to satisfy him. He once asked a friend to help him kill and skin a sheep. Now, there's lots of farmers around Nuneaton that keep sheep. Perhaps he was going to go to one of those farms in order to satisfy his bloodlust. I don't know. Fortunately, his friend refused to get involved with this sinister plan. With regard to Naomi, the night she pops out to the post box was around the same time and the same night that Edwin left his sister's house to purchase beer and crisps, which wasn't that far away from the post box. His journey would have only taken about 5, maybe 6 minutes to complete, yet he was gone for 45 minutes according to his sister. Naomi knew him and actually confided in friends when she was alive that she fancied Edwin. Now, this made Paul Britton, the profiler, look good, as he said that the killer was probably someone she knew. One of the police statements came from a witness who lived opposite the post box who saw Naomi standing near it, next to a path known locally as the Jitty, and watched her eventually walk up that pathway until she was out of sight. And within 2, maybe 3 hours, from that, she was found dead by her own father underneath that slide. As he put his headlights on facing the playground, he received the biggest shock of his life, and Emma experienced it with him. Naomi was finally discovered, only yards away from home, slumped on the floor of the playground underneath a slide. However, after Brian reported this awful event, it was followed by an extensive investigation with the use of science, which ultimately led to weeding out the culprit, the 19-year-old Edward Hopkins. The DNA evidence from saliva extracted from Naomi came through as a match to this guy, with odds of 36 million to 1 against him. Forensic orthodontists made a cast of his teeth, with its impression matching the bite mark found on the victim's breast. Then we have the alibi given from, then taken away by his sister, with all of this categorically pointing toward his 6'2" 13 stone frame as being that of a very evil man. So making that unusual step of sharing details of the injuries Naomi suffered while using criminal profiler Paul Britton alongside the newly established Forensic Science Service and being diligent in their inquiries was more than enough for the authorities to catch this deranged killer, who was consequently charged and sentenced. In February 1997, at the age of 20, Edwin Hopkins was jailed for life with a minimum term of 18 years for the murder of 15-year-old Naomi Smith, while refusing point blank to accept his guilt despite the overwhelming evidence. In 2021, he was transferred to an open prison, an environment that prepares these type of offenders for eventual release. Overall, he spent over 25 years behind bars, and the powers that be seem in favour of his potential release, even though he never accepted his guilt.